Hello YouTube, and welcome to the first episode of Sega SG Awesome. I noticed that there wasn't a lot of information on YouTube, or even the web, on Sega's very first system, the SG-1000. This web series is devoted to exploring and shedding some light on Sega's first console. Each week I'll put out a video exploring a new game. It's not going to be a playthrough, walkthrough, review, or anything like that. It's not even going to be me playing the game badly. The purpose of the series is to explore and understand Sega's early days a little bit more, and maybe throw in a few Steve Benway references. I feel like this is needed because I am a huge Sega fan, but I didn't even know that the SG-1000 existed until a few years ago. Looking on YouTube, there's not a lot of information available. Games have become forgotten, names have been lost, and I want to understand one of my favorite entertainment mediums a little bit more. And I want to make this effort available to others. I'll be taking kind of a Nintendo style and exploring each game by release date. On the SG-1000 this can be very difficult to find, so I'm going to be using the catalog number, so they may not be in quite chronological order whenever it comes to release dates, but that's kind of the best that it seems like we can do. This first episode is just going to provide a quick overview of the system itself, and also the setting that the release date found itself in. The console was test marketed in 1981, but it wasn't officially released until July 15th, 1983. Now this is an interesting date because this is the exact same day that Nintendo released the Famicom. This release date is very fortuitous in retrospect, at least in terms of symbolism, just because those two companies had a humongous console war for the next 15 years. But 1981 test market date is fairly significant. The SG-1000 is not nearly as powerful as a Famicom, and I believe the early release has to do a lot with that. It's not that the console was actually made for 1983, it was made for 1981. This puts it around the release date of the ColecoVision, which is what the system is on par with. It's also very similar to the MSX computing platform. It's so similar, in fact, to the ColecoVision and the MSX, that a lot of homebrew games exist for the ColecoVision that are just ports of the SG-1000. Another interesting cross-platform feature of the SG-1000 is that you can play some MSX games on the SG-1000. This is done with a cartridge adapter. This adapter was found in Taiwan, where the SG-1000 was most popular. Now, the MSX games are ports, and the adapter does double the memory of the SG-1000. One distinction that I have difficulty with, and a lot of other people seem to have problems with as well, is whether or not the SG-1000 is really a different console from the Master System. I'm going to explore 5 of the SG-1000's redesigns. The original model looked very much like a toy in my opinion. It came with a joystick that had a, at least outward design, very reminiscent of the Atari 5200 or even the ColecoVision, where it has a joystick on top and then the side buttons. This was quickly redesigned to the SG-1000 I believe that a lot of this had to do with the way Sega was promoting the system. If you watch some early advertisements of the system, you will see Sega going for a fairly futuristic sci-fi approach, as well as even branding it as a home computer. This really didn't mix well with the toyish appearance. The revision created a much more sci-fi look, as well as provide some Famicom-style controls. Sega at this time was really pushing the space game market. Keep in mind that the launch titles for the Famicom were Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. Famicom really didn't have a lot of variation to start with. I feel like Sega was attempting to exploit this and brand itself as a shooter platform. Interestingly enough, this trend kind of continued into the Saturn and Dreamcast years. Now ultimately this didn't work because the Famicom had third-party support which provided much better variation than the SG-1000 ever had. But to illustrate this focus that Sega had, watch some of these early advertisements featuring the actress Yuko Saito.
先生、あれは新しい星ですか？あれは欲しいですね。エクセリオン、オーガス、スタージャッカ、みんな欲しいですよ。
セガならソフトの数だけ興奮がある。
宇宙ソフトも続々。と楽しめるビデオゲーム SG-1000 に専用キーボード SK-1100
This early commercial kind of featured a bit of a slogan with a Tonikaku phrase. The actress Yuko Saito goes through and mentions several of the features of the Master System, but when she gets to the fourth one, can't come up with one, makes a giggling sound and says Tonikaku Tanoshi. This roughly translates to, anyways, it's fun. Now, in retrospect, the advertising strategy of not being able to come up with 4 features and stating, in any case, it's fun, probably wasn't the best marketing strategy to sell your product. Let's just say this advertising campaign was not nearly as effective as the mid-90s advertising campaigns of hitting baseball players in the balls.
The designers of Sega's new World Series Baseball set up cameras to capture what it really feels like in a Major League box, then made it so you can pick any Major League team in any ballpark, and made it have all the players, even the guys riding a pine. So with Sega's new World Series Baseball, everything happens, well, more like it does in real life. Oh! Sega!
But as the advertising campaigns went on, the commercials did get better. They all featured Yuko Saito, and usually she was in a costume or setting related to the game. This reminds me a lot of the later advertising campaigns of the Sega Saturn featuring Segata Sanshiro. They also got a little funnier and kid-friendly in a Looney Tunes type of way with cartoon bombs. I like to think of this as Sega's buy our system or we'll blow you up era. But one of the most fascinating things about this commercial is that the Sega chime is present and very prominent. It was during this portion of the advertising campaign and of the Sega SG-1000 where Sega was experimenting with the system's identity a little bit more. Both versions of the system released only had a slot for cartridges, but Sega started releasing games on these card formats. But they did require an additional accessory called the card catcher, considering that these first systems did not actually have the card slot. Unfortunately, these cards also didn't hold very much space, about 256 kilobytes. The small size did not help in the tech war with Nintendo. Nintendo already had a technological lead at that point, and having a bunch of games that contained less space than the Nintendo cards didn't help. This is where the third revision comes in, the Sega Mark III. The Sega Mark III features a card catcher built in. It also doubled the memory and features a new video processor. This makes the system more powerful than the Famicom, but also makes it difficult to call it the third revision of the SG-1000. In any accounts, it certainly is a third revision of the SG-1000, but it also brings up the point of, at what point does a system become a different system? The Master System and the Mark III are compatible with the SG-1000 games, but because of the difference in the video processor, it does run with the colors looking a little bit different. Now, this isn't a big deal. Some of the Master System games did this as well, such as F-16 Fighting Falcon. Jumping ahead on a side note, the Genesis and Mega Drive can play Master System Mark III games, but they cannot play SG-1000 games because of this video mode. This means that SG-1000 games are not compatible with the power-based converter. Same with F-16 Flying Falcon, you just can't play it on the power-based converter. Finally, a fourth revision came out branded the Master System. This is the version most of the world is familiar with. The Master System is backwards compatible with all SG-1000 games. However, Western systems will not work out of the box, so don't go to eBay and start buying these games. This is due to 2 reasons. One, the cartridge and pin layouts are physically different. But the often cited physical difference is not the largest underlying reason. The biggest reason is the BIOS ran at startup. The Master System does an authentication check for the games. The SG-1000 games just do not have this authentication code in the header files that are required by the Western systems. The Western versions require this authentication code. Now there is a way to bypass that, and that is with the flash cart. The flash cart loads its own operating system to select the ROMs at the very beginning. This is what the BIOS checks. After that you can select the ROMs. Basically acts like a boot disk for modern CD-based systems. This is the way to go if you own a Western console and just want to play the games. Now there is also a fifth variation in a way, and that's the Sega Game Gear. The Game Gear is essentially a portable Master System, and believe it or not, it is possible to play SG-1000 games on the Game Gear using a flash card. Now, however, you do have to go in and modify and edit the ROMs a little bit. This mainly goes through and makes everything actually work with the Game Gear color palette, but it is possible. With all of this, it's hard to call the SG-1000 its own system. It's hard to really call any of Sega's 8-bit lineup different systems, and where the SG-1000 may not be considered a massive success, I certainly can't call it a failure. And a lot of this has to do with its relation to all the 8-bit systems. Its architecture is essentially the Master System, which is essentially the Game Gear. This gives Sega's 8-bit lineup a lifespan of almost 20 years. This beats out the Famicom on any rate. This goes from the beginning 1981 test date all the way to the Majesco release of the Sega Game Gear in 1998. This is just a few years before Sega exited the console market. So by understanding Sega's 8-bit lineup, you can actually understand Sega through pretty much its entire lifespan as a console manufacturer. And this understanding is one of the main goals of this web series. To understand Sega's 8-bit lineup, starting with the SG-1000, which is not very well known, and thus understand Sega a little bit better. The SG-1000 game lineup features references to pop culture, missing links in game design, and even the very first games created by some of the greats such as Yu Suzuki and Yuji Naka. We will begin this exploration next week with the very first catalog number, 1001 Borderline. If you're interested, be sure to comment, subscribe, like, and definitely leave comments on what you would like to see in this video. If there's something that you want me to try to dig up, let me know.